Hey everyone, thanks for joining today. We're going to get started now. Want to be respectful for everyone's time. My name is Brian Ronholm, and I'm Director of Food Policy for Consumer Reports. And we are pleased to be co-hosting this webinar with AFDO to discuss the Reagan-Udall Foundation top-to-bottom review of the FDA Foods Program. And joining me today is the distinguished panel, including Dr. Ostroff, Dr. Steven Ostroff, former Deputy Commissioner for Food, and also served some time as acting FDA Commissioner. After him comes Jennifer Mcintyre. She is the Chief Food Safety and Regulatory Officer for International Fresh Produce Association. And then batting cleanup today is Joe Corby. He is former Director of Food Safety at the New York Department of Agriculture, and he's currently a Senior Advisor for AFDO. So certainly you'll get a really good perspective of everything going on with the FDA Foods Program today. So appreciate you listening in, and hopefully this is beneficial, and encourage you all to make some comments in the comment portal for this review. I'll just kind of start things off just talking about, just over recent years, it's become evident that the Foods Program at FDA is in need of a significant culture change that would allow for more of a focus on illness prevention that was supposed to be enshrined with the passage of FSMA back in 2011. And with that was supposed to come improved governance, accountability, and transparency. But what we've seen transpire over the years, and many of us have experienced, is the inadequate response to recalls. You've seen a failure to move quickly on proposed rules and initiatives. And so there's been a number of questions compiling about whether the FDA is performing its regulatory role effectively. And it appears to be struggling in its role to protect consumers and prevent the food industry from operating effectively. Now, as we all know, the success of the Foods Program and its initiatives depend on all the major program units. That's the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, CFSAN, the Center for Veterinary Medicine, CVM, and the Office of Regulatory Affairs, ORA, collaborating seamlessly with a common strategic direction, clear priorities, effective resource management, and accountability. And what we've seen play out instead is this siloed approach that each office takes toward food. And then, so there's little collaboration, there's little strategic planning, and you see a lot of it played out with what happened with the infant formula debacle, where there were communication breakdowns, there's ineffective response, failure to pick up on key points at the Sturgis facility in Michigan. So, another key challenge for the Foods Program is that it lacks a single full-time, fully empowered expert leader of all of these aspects of the food program. And so the fragmented structure has resulted in delays in making compliance decisions, including these recalls. So the duplicative multiple compliance recall groups within each part of the food program and the lack of unifying leadership often results in these delays and this dysfunction and lack of urgency. So it's led to this, this whole fragmented structure that exists within the food program has led an unprecedented coalition of consumer groups, industry trade associations, and state and local regulators, all reflected in this webinar. We've all joined together to call on FDA to unify the food program under a Deputy Commissioner for Foods. It would have line authority over CFSAN, CVM, and the food-related components of ORA. And so now what's going on is the Reagan-Udall Foundation has been tasked by the FDA to conduct a so-called top-to-bottom review of the Foods Program to kind of figure out, what's going wrong and kind of deliver recommendations in a short amount of time. The report is due December 6th. Deliver these recommendations to the commissioner on how things can be changed. And this is where we all hope that you can come in. Part of the review involves a portal that they've opened up for public comment, and the time frame is tight. The deadline for comments submitted is this Friday, October 7th. So we're hoping that the information that we share in this webinar will encourage all of you to submit these remarks to the stakeholder portal. We all have stories, we all have examples of where the dysfunction lies in the Foods Program. And so today I'm just I'll turn it over to the panelists to kind of give a little more insight and context and perspective on the foods program, to kind of give you a sense of how deep the dysfunction is, how extensive it is, and how much needs to change. So why don't we go ahead and lead off with the distinguished Dr. Steven Ostroff, former Deputy Commissioner for Foods Program, who's obviously been there and done that and knows what works and what doesn't. So Dr. Ostroff.
Well, thanks very much, Brian. And I have to echo and support everything that you just said. I will say in the way of my background that the one thing that Brian didn't mention is that I also worked in the state health department. And so I feel a kinship and allegiance to this particular group. I'm going to put up some slides to try to highlight some of the things that I said as a panelist last week before the group that was tasked with examining the food program. And so let me see if I can bring up my slides, and please let me know if you're able to see them. Is it working? Oh, great. Okay. So what I wanted to start with is what the actual charge to the panel was that was given to the group that's doing this review. And that was to examine FDA's human foods program with a focus on the structure and leadership, authority, resources, and culture in developing recommendations to equip FDA to better carry out its regulatory responsibilities. And I've highlighted strengthen its relationship with state and local governments and secure the nation's supply for the future, food supply for the future. The review excludes cosmetics and dietary supplement responsibilities. And the specific questions that we were asked to comment on was, what is working well? What are the key challenges to the agency? What are the emerging issues and challenges, and what recommendations do you propose? So in terms of what's going well, the two things, and I work there, and so I know FDA has great people. And these folks have been working in challenging circumstances. I probably don't have to tell anyone on the phone how difficult or listening to this video, how difficult it is these days to work in government at any level. And the other thing that I think is actually going better than I think is appreciated is how strong the scientific underpinnings of much of the work that FDA does. And I would especially say in the lab and things like Genome Tracker and the spectacular success that's actually had. But what are the problems? And a lot of the focus during the discussions last week, and a lot of what I focused on since I worked on the inside and was the Deputy Commissioner for Foods and Veterinary Medicine when I was there, is the structure and leadership of the food activities at FDA. And I do think it's important to sort of put up this particular slide because as a result of FSMA back in the late 2010s, which was actually passed by Congress in 2011, a new structure was put in place at FDA for food-related activities. And that was that there was a setup where there were two deputy commissioners that worked on food-related issues. One was the Deputy Commissioner for Global Regulatory Operations and Policy, who had responsibility and direct reporting of the Office of Regulatory Affairs. And then there was a Deputy Commissioner for Foods and Veterinary Medicine, who had line authority over the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, or CFSAN, and the Center for Veterinary Medicine. This structure was put in place as a way to achieve the vision of FSMA to be able to enhance coordination, improve management and stakeholder responsiveness, and to assure us responsibility for what was actually going on within the food program. However, it is important to note that in this structure, the field activities, i.e. ORA, was kept separate from headquarters programs and had its own management and its own control of resources, which I think is, as many of us saw over the years that this structure was in place, led to some challenges even then of coordination. However, in 2018, a different model was put in place. And while this looks a lot simpler, I actually think that it has led to a number of the problems that we've seen in recent years. which is that the three components that work on food at FDA, the Office of Regulatory Affairs, CFSAN, and CVM, were made direct reports to the commissioner. And the position that I was in, along with Mike Taylor, the Deputy Commissioner for Foods and Veterinary Medicine, was transformed into a new position that was called the Deputy Commissioner for Food Policy and Response, but very importantly, was not given line authority over any of the activities that went on in food-related activities at FDA. And so in this model that persists to the present, the Deputy Commissioner no longer has line authority over the programs, and it raises the question of who's actually in charge. Now, if you look at this model, you would clearly say it's the FDA Commissioner that's in charge. But one of the problems with the FDA Commissioner being in charge, I think, are twofold. One of them is that their attention is by and large focused on the other parts of the agency, which dominate the agenda at FDA, medical products and tobacco. And in addition to that, except for me when I was in the role of acting commissioner, person who's been in charge at FDA, the commissioner, has not had a background in either how our food system in the United States actually works or has much of a background in food regulation. And so it's very problematic to have these components directly reporting to the commissioner with the idea that the commissioner is going to be in a position to understand a lot of what is being discussed. And the other problem that it's raised is who do stakeholders go to on any particular issue. So I think that the current structure that's in place has led to fragmentation of food activities. There is poor internal coordination, very inefficient use of resources. There's inefficient decision-making. There's poor communications, both inside the agency as well as to stakeholders, poor stakeholder engagement, and unfortunately not timeliness in a lot of circumstances where timeliness is very important. Now, we often hear the adage that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, but I think that the opposite is true here, which is that the individual parts do not make the whole greater. And so what we have here, I would say, is rather than a cohesive food program, is that we have multiple agency components that work on food issues, often at cross purposes to each other. I also think that the exclusion of CVM, and if you go back to the original charge, it was to examine the human foods component in the panel's charge, so shows a poor understanding of the impact that CVM's work has on human foods. And I think there are a number of examples of this. So what are the potential solutions? One of them that was offered by Steve Sunloff, who was a former director of both CVM as well as CFSAN, was to essentially just keep the current structure and better delineate responsibilities to ORA and the centers. I don't think that works, and I don't think that that would make a substantive difference in terms of the problems that we've been seeing. So some of the options are, one, to have an empowered deputy commissioner, i.e. to use the FSIS model that seems to work quite well at USDA. And that empowered deputy commissioner should have authority over CVM, and it should also include ORA's food activities, what Brian mentioned earlier. Another option is to have a separate center for food safety and a separate center for nutrition. There were other panels during the discussion about nutrition. You're probably all aware of the big meeting that occurred at the White House last week. And in order to raise the profile of nutrition-related activities, which are so important, one consideration would be to set up a separate center that just works on nutrition and let the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition exclusively focus on food safety-related issues. Another suggestion that came up by several speakers was to have co-commissioners, have a commissioner for medical products and tobacco and a commissioner for the food program at FDA. And I do think that's an interesting proposal. And of course, another possibility is to actually move the food activities into a completely separate agency and have a federal agency that exclusively works on food. Another problem, I think, is the culture of the agency. And I think that manifests itself by relatively poor engagement with stakeholders. And I think what you see on the bottom left is sort of the model that very often seems to be operative, which is the engagement often seems very one-sided. There's discussion going on, but I'm not quite sure that the folks there are really listening to what the stakeholders are saying. And that includes industry, consumers, states, and locals. And I think that there needs to be much better communication of what FDA is actually doing. The activities that are going on, the actions that are being taken, and the timeframes in which there may be an expectation to see something come out. I use the analogy, things seem to go into the foods program, it sloshes around in the food program, and then at some point something comes out, but it's never clear when that's going to happen and how it's going to happen. And often stakeholders are caught by surprise. And I think that this applies to not only the development of regs and guidances, but also what goes on with inspections, what happens during outbreaks, and what happens during recalls. There needs to be much greater opportunity for external input. And currently on the food side, there are no external federal advisory committees to either CVM or CFSAN, and I think that that really has to change. In terms of resources, this is obviously a big focus. The food activities definitely have to be better resourced. Currently at FDA, the food component of the agency comprises only about 15% of the budget and only about 20% of the personnel. Everything is dominated by the medical product side. And of the funding and personnel that are available, 2/3 of them are present in ORA. And so there's really a paucity of resources and a paucity of personnel actually dealing with the food programs. Congress has not funded food programs adequately up to this point, despite having a very detailed list of what was required to implement FSMA. And I don't think that they're likely to do so now. The overwhelming difference between the medical products and tobacco side of FDA and the foods program is that the medical products and tobacco have user fees. FDA does not. User fees are not a panacea, but I do think that they offer certainty and performance from the foods program that is not currently present. But to be effective, any added resources must be tied to other reforms. Last thing that I'll mention is authorities. There was not a lot of discussion about authorities for the agency, but the one that I did propose is that especially as a result of the infant formula problem, FDA really does need better supply chain oversight. It's recognized on the medical product side, but it's never really been an issue on the food side until what we saw with the infant formula. And my proposal would be that Congress needs to specifically authorize FDA to designate a series of critical foods and ingredients that require supply chain oversight and data collection in terms of what the status of the supply chain happens to be, so that adequate steps can be taken to mitigate any shortages, and there could be a reasonable notification of any problems when they may arise. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Brian.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Ostroff, for that. Next, we will turn to Dr. Jennifer Mcintyre. Again, she's the Chief Food Safety and Regulatory Officer for the International Fresh Produce Association, IFPA, and Jen played a major role in this effort. Obviously, it's an industry that's regulated by the FDA, and so I'm sure they have plenty of examples of the dysfunction in the foods program. Jen.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me to join. It is tough to follow Dr. Ostroff. I will do my best. I do not have slides. Yeah, fresh produce is, as far as I can tell, the only product category that's regulated that each of the FSMA rules applies to at some point in the supply chain, from the produce safety rule to preventive controls for fresh cut, foreign supplier verification, and even maybe some pockets of the intentional adulteration rules. So we see it all on the produce side, but my comments last week were really reflective of my experience even beyond produce and kind of the changes that I've seen in the interactions with FDA over the course of the past 20 years. So, through different administrations, different commissioners, different structures within the agency, and just looking at some kind of compare and contrast and how things have evolved, where we're at right now and where I think we need to be in the future. So I'll do my best to augment Dr. Ostroff's comments and give at least the takeaways, the things that I heard last week, Thursday, Friday, when the Reagan-Udall Foundation had the meeting, had invited many of us in to give our couple-minute overview. The expert panel asked several of us really good questions, and I know is conducting interviews with several other individuals, both within FDA as well as outside of FDA. So to start, one of the areas of consensus, as Dr. Ostroff mentioned, was that there are excellent people currently working in the foods program across the different parts of the foods programs at FDA. I know I personally reach out often. I get a very prompt response, a thorough response, and so that is fantastic. The challenge does lie when it becomes difficult to figure out who's actually making a decision, who's prioritizing some efforts. One of the things that I want to urge everyone listening today to do is to submit comments. We each have our own experiences with FDA. We each have our vision of what better might look like. And I think this opportunity to provide comments to an expert panel, which are due Friday, so a little bit of a rush job, but I haven't seen an opportunity like this present itself before. We always have the opportunity to comment to FDA directly on certain rules, but to talk about how the agency is organized, culture, authority, resources, leadership, it is a rare opportunity. So please do take advantage of that. A few of the things that I heard last week that stood out to me, there was a proposal, nutrition was one of the kind of sessions, a proposal to redefine food safety to include nutrition, recognizing the health impacts of the diet. So if in considering chronic disease in particular, should food safety be broadened beyond just the acute foodborne illness, microbial foodborne illness, chemical toxicity, to look at some of the broader aspects of the diet. There was also a strong call to enhance the funding and prioritization of nutrition-related work. Given that consequences are generally longer term, it's easy sometimes to push those things down the road and deal with the crisis at hand, which often are the outbreak-related issues, easy to articulate and capture, and deprioritize some of the nutrition-related work at the agency. So how can that be addressed was a question that was asked. There was generally consensus around the need for whether it's an empowered deputy commissioner with that line authority over CFSAN and CVM and the food parts of ORA, or other construct in which someone, one person would be identified as being in charge, having that leadership, having that authority. There were different mechanisms that were proposed, as Dr. Ostroff mentioned, whether that is a deputy commissioner, whether it's someone who is a political appointee or not, whether the agency should be divided into foods and drugs with these co-commissioners. But the bottom line, I think, with very, very few exceptions, almost everyone invited to speak felt the need to have that point person, that person who could make decisions and really align the agency to create that effective and efficient foods programs. There were concerns, or not concerns, but maybe questions that were asked regarding that sort of structure within FDA, if that would demote the center directors, if it would reduce the talent pool of individuals who would be interested in being center directors. And I think the consensus of most of the people who were asked this question was that no, the center directors play a critically important role, would continue to play a critically important role, and really would have perhaps greater support if organized the right way, given the multiple issues that the FDA, if we kept things within FDA today, the multiple things the FDA commissioner needs to handle on not just the food side, but especially on the drug side. So having a point person for food, someone with expertise for food, was viewed as being very advantageous. Another theme that emerged was around transparency, and this took several forms. There was transparency related to budget, accounting, how funds are currently being used. So the Reagan-Udall Foundation had asked several of us to comment on resources, and it's difficult to comment on resources when you don't have a clear understanding of how funds are being used today, what the needs are today. So there was a call for that transparency. Also transparency around how FDA thinks about the work that it needs to do. What is the strategy? What are the priorities that the agency has set out for itself? How are those priorities determined? Clarity around those decisions and those processes. An area that I think would be of particular interest to an AFDO audience was the sharing of data with states in both outbreak situations as well as during in kind of routine inspections. So what information is being shared from FDA to states? What information is being shared from states to FDA? This was an area that my perception was the expert panel was very intrigued by this discussion. I think there's a lot of opportunity for states and others to talk about how information is shared, what information is shared, constraints, restraints, redundancies. I know on the industry side, often we feel that we're being asked the same questions by many different entities, and you scratch your head and go, aren't they talking to each other? So this was an area that was also elevated in the discussion last week. There were many mentions of prevention. I think Brian mentioned this move, that FSMA's goal was to move FDA and the industry from a reactive approach to a preventive, proactive approach and philosophy around food safety. And evaluating the progress FDA has made in turning that ship toward prevention was questioned. So is there still a heavy reliance on compliance? What does that mean? What does collaboration mean? Is there sometimes the gotcha mentality? What does that partnership and collaboration really look like? And how can we work better together, all stakeholders, to move that toward that prevention orientation? Dr. Ostroff mentioned funding in the form of user fees, and this was an area that I think every discussion Thursday and Friday talked about user fees. And there was a split, a difference in opinion of the value of user fees. I think there is no question that if we saw the details of how FDA's budget is currently being used to support the breadth of the foods program, that there surely is a need for additional resources, but how can that be supported? Dr. Ostroff mentioned that it's unlikely that Congress would give a whole lot more. Is user fees an alternative? There are many logistical challenges associated with user fees, and a pretty easy, I think, way to compare and contrast with the medical devices. You know, the word user fees, it implies that there is a user, that there's a service that's being provided. And on the food side, there is no for the breadth of food, there's not a pre-market approval. It's really inspections. And so how does a user fee concept, how would that work in food? There was recognition that we would need to be very cautious about the impact on small businesses, that there would be logistical challenges, just how would the agency collect such fees? So I think that this is an area that needs much more evaluation and discussion and careful consideration before making a recommendation that there should be user fees. There is also, within that discussion of resources and user fees, the recognition that this is probably not a problem that we can just throw money at, regardless of where the money came from. I personally don't think that money is going to solve all of the issues that we faced. There are pockets, and several of us mentioned pockets of good things happening. And I've seen, I guess if I had to plot it out on a timeline, things were going well for a while. There was a precipitous decline in the relationship over the past couple of months, and certainly the past couple of weeks, I have seen a bit more outreach from the agency in different parts of FDA, both the ORA side as well as the SIPSAN side. And so that is welcome. How can we continue and push on that trajectory, I think, is a question, and one where we should all be very vocal in our input. So what the Reagan-Udall Foundation is looking for in terms of comment, if you go to that portal that was on that first slide, there are 3 boxes. You have a 2,000 character limit per box, so about 500 words-ish to answer. One question is, what is the greatest challenge facing the foods program at FDA? Another question is, what are the greatest strengths? And the last question is, what are the recommendations for improvement? So I hope that you'll each carefully consider those 3 questions, how you would want to answer them. I think there was a note on the slide that you can answer anonymously. So I know some have expressed concern of retribution, retaliation. So you can go ahead and submit those comments anonymously, but they are due Friday. And again, please take advantage of this opportunity. With that, Brian, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. Appreciate that. And finally, we'll turn it over to a gentleman probably doesn't need an introduction because we all know Joe Corby. He's former director of food safety at the New York Department of Agriculture and currently a senior advisor for AFDO. Joe, over to you.
Thank you, Brian. I always like to go last on panels. I get to repeat everything that others have already said. And really, I did go to the meeting last week, and I don't know, there's like 30 short presentations that were given to the panel. And there was a lot of unison. There was a lot of things that people generally agreed on. And I think you'll actually hear that again today with the 3 of us. I do want to stress the importance of commenting, and I'll give a particular push to my very close friends in state and local agencies that I hope they do submit comments into the portal. It really is a huge opportunity for us to influence change at FDA, and I think change would and can allow us to enhance any efforts we're employing to advance an integrated food safety system. Understanding we've spent 25 years, the regulatory community has spent 25 years in developing a integrated food safety system and implementing strategies. I mean, think of what we've done. We've created and implemented regulatory program standards. We've built alliances. We've established networks for information sharing, for communications and surveillance. We've accredited food laboratories, the state food labs. We've established a system for FDA funding, and we attempted to provide a newfound spirit of trust and regard for one another, which really is important. And we've taken huge strides at the state level as well through contracts for inspections, partnerships, cooperative agreements, and what I believe is the way of the future, mutual reliance programs. Each of these can be strengthened. Each of those can be expanded. And I think that begins with your comments this week into the portal so we can enact some very necessary changes. I did want to mention or talk just a little bit about the program standards because that is one thing I believe is working. These regulatory program standards, 25 years ago, when we sat down with people and were talking about advancing integrated food safety system, we heard, particularly from consumer groups, that they would never go along with it because they didn't have the faith in state agencies and local agencies. They believed that that our avenue was to just do the restaurants and those grocery stores, which weren't high-risk establishments. We'll leave those to the states, but not in manufactured foods and not in these very serious consumer complaints or illness investigations. They couldn't see where we really belonged in that. And not only did that infuriated us, it really was a motivation for us to put together these regulatory program standards. And maybe that's why we've been spending 25 years, but nevertheless, we have built them. These things work. We have a majority of the states that are in full compliance or substantial compliance with these program standards. And we established equivalence with FDA, that we're all equivalent. And if we're all equivalent, there's really so much we can do, so much more we can do in terms of sharing equipment, not equipment, I'm sorry, sharing inspection results, sharing information, sharing data, sharing inventories. There's so much we can do. I mean, an FDA can rely more and more on a state because they have met those program standards and they're in the state of mutual reliance. And don't forget the food laboratories. I learned last week that there are 44 state laboratories that are now accredited, ISO accredited. I mean, FDA can now take advantage of these accredited labs' analytical work. And the states are doing hundreds and hundreds of thousands of testing of foods every year. And that's just an enormous amount of data that could be accessed. So if you want to know what's working, it's those regulatory program standards. We spent a lot of time developing them, and it allows us to really advance and do a lot more in an integrated food safety system. But, you know, two of the questions that the portal will ask you is what the greatest challenges are. And again, I think the greatest challenge, in my view, deals with the organizational structure of FDA and how can they become more effective in an integrated food safety system. It is fragmented and it is somewhat complex. And because of that, it sometimes prolongs the period it takes to get decisions made and sometimes weakens our response efforts. I think Dr. Ostroff mentioned last week that it's multiple programs trying to be one program. And I think that is a good characterization. And that becomes problematic. But what bothers me the most about when I was working with New York, these things existed, and we expect, well, if you're going to if you got a call in FDA, it may take a little while because they've got to go through this. We've got to get council's approval to do it. We've been conditioned to accept these things, and I don't know why we don't address them. It has been driven into our culture, and this culture, in my view, is hindering our progress in building a fully integrated food safety system. I think the organizational concerns can be addressed maybe somewhat quickly, but the food safety culture issues are going to take some time. These are two challenges we got to address for food protection and public health, and it begins, I think, with your comments into the portal. It's easy to criticize, but I would not leave you without talking about, you know, the good people that exist at FDA. They're talented, they're knowledgeable, and I especially appreciate those who support stakeholder partnerships. And fortunately, I believe the majority of FDA officials do value those partnerships, because we have a great deal of milestone achievements that we have accomplished together, particularly with FDA's Office of Regulatory Affairs and their Division of Integration, their Office of Partnerships. These people work very, very closely with states. We've done many innovative and cutting edge things together, and we've also saved lives. I could write a book about in my years of working with the state, the instances where I believe our actions and inspections and investigations have saved lives. But we're not fishing for compliments. We're only trying to improve our system and expand it. And I think the way to do it is to continue our progress in building our integrated food safety system. As far as recommendations, again, mine are very similar to what you have heard before and what was said last week. I think there is indeed a need for a singular empowered FDA person, perhaps a deputy commissioner for foods program. Again, it can't be just any individual. That's the key here. It's got to be someone who is familiar with foods and someone who understands the fundamental role of states and locals in our food safety system. Another recommendation is, I think we need to ensure work planning is conducted. I heard some things last week about certain states are upset with funding, or they're upset with data sharing. These things, I believe, can be and should be resolved first and foremost at the state level through work planning. And if that is not being done in a state, it certainly should be. I also think we need to identify mechanisms and processes, both legal and technological, that would allow us to better share information. That continues to be a problem, and I know that we are all trying to work on that, but it is important that we better share information. So anyway, in our 25-year effort to produce this fully integrated food safety system in our country, we had to jump over a lot of hurdles and a lot of barriers to advance our vision. I can remember many years ago when our effort was defunded and abolished. And it really broke a lot of our hearts. We put a lot of work in it, and all of a sudden they defunded it and abolished it. But it came back. It came back because it was a good idea. And it came back, and you could see it with FDA when they put it in their new initiatives and all these things they would announce to the public. They would talk about they needed to work closer with their partners. It came back because stakeholders truly wanted to be partners with FDA improving the safety of our food. And it came back because I think everyone accepts integration as the only real way to improve our food safety system. So I'll just finish by again stressing, I hope we do get comments into the portal, and again, another push to my close friends at the state and local levels. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. Appreciate your perspective, and certainly you bring a lot in terms of experience with the FDA Foods program, and certainly encourage everyone to enter questions into the chat, and we'll certainly monitor it. But just kind of want to get the conversation going. Clearly, it's critical that we all submit comments into this portal. Again, as Jen mentioned, the deadline is this Friday, October 7th. It's a chance to kind of air grievances. Think of it as a 1-week Festivus for the Seinfeld fans out there. And as Jen also mentioned, you can submit anonymous comments, certainly providing your perspective, certainly be very helpful in educating the independent expert panel on the dynamic that exists out there and the dysfunction. Certainly it's very important for them to hear. And also, go to the portal just to kind of monitor some of the comments that are being submitted. They're beginning to post a lot of them already. You can get a sense of kind of the type of comments that have been submitted, and a lot of them are already coming in from FDA staff anonymously. So those are certainly worth a read if you get an opportunity to do that. We're tracing the calls, and a lot of them are coming from inside the house. So it's a good way to kind of get a snapshot into the internal dynamic of the foods program at FDA. And I'll just kind of throw out a general question to the panel, just in terms of, particularly what's important to AFDO members and the kind of the state partnership, the state partnerships that exist with the foods program with FDA. And Dr. Ostroff, I'm curious to kind of get your perspective on this too, just in terms of what you've seen of how things have broken down between perhaps the time when you were there to what you see now happening with the communications, with the interactions with the state and local partners. Clearly, there's some problems there, and it would be great to get your perspective on what has worked, what you've seen work in the past, and how that's all kind of broken down to the point where we are now.
Yeah, well, let me try to answer that with sort of a couple of examples. I think one of them, which is a big problem, is that virtually nobody at FDA has had experience working at a state or local level. And so I don't think that they have a great appreciation for the challenges and opportunities that happen at the state and local level. And so I think that they would benefit from having more of that experience. Let me just a couple of brief examples. As I said, I worked at the state health department for a number of years in Pennsylvania, and right after I started in that position, there was a outbreak that we were investigating that involved an FDA regulated product. And when we tried to interact with them, it didn't go very well because they didn't want to share any information. They said to me, well, you need to have a commission in order for us to really meaningfully be able to share any information. And so I said, fine, I'll do that. But even after I went ahead and did that, they still didn't want to share any information, including whether or not they were actually in the state doing any inspections. It was really quite vexing. I hope it's significantly better than that now. Another example, and I think this came up in some of the sessions, is this continued reliance on contracts, especially for manufactured food. I find that very condescending, quite frankly. It suggests to me that they're buying services from the state rather than having a true partnership. I can't tell you how many times when I was there, I had suggested to them that they converted those contracts over to cooperative agreements. But of course, that was one of the vexing problems with having ORA handle this separately out of my sort of line authority. So I wasn't really in a position to influence the way that they do things. And I know now there are, if anything, some pretty significant challenges with those contracts. And I think a number of folks from the states sort of raised what some of those problems are, which is that you can't necessarily rely from one year to the next in terms of the number of inspections that they're going to be paying for. And it makes it difficult to bring on staff. And in addition to that, since they've tried to staff up their inspectorate, generally with folks that they've sort of picked off from the states, that it means less work for the states. And so I think that whole sort of relationship needs to be reexamined, and we need to think about new models to actually better work with the states in partnership.
Can I add something, Brian?
Of course, Joe.
Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to say. The opportunities are there, particularly when a state has met the program standards or the lab has been accredited. I spoke highly about work planning, but during work planning is not just shelling out inspections or deciding who's going to sample this or that. It's really an opportunity to explore some innovative things. And I mean, and it's been done in several states around the country, whether it is accepting an FDA contract as a state contract, so that state can take enforcement action, or vice versa. I mean, FDA may be getting a number of inspections from the states on high risk. But the states are in there multiple times a year, and there's just a lot of information that one could get from those inspections. And I mentioned how many samples that are taken in state laboratories and analyzed. There's just so much you can do. There's been the New York lab, for instance, I believe has something special going on with colors, and they have a mutual reliance program with FDA. These are really innovative, important things that really could be expanded.
Great. Thanks, Joe. Jen, you brought up a good point about the resources, and obviously I think there's general consensus, and I see some questions coming in now. I'll certainly bring those up, but you brought up a good point about resources. I think there's general agreement that there is a need, but there needs to be some greater accountability with those additional resources. I think we don't want a situation where Congress is providing additional resources in some form or fashion, but then all it does is go into the existing structure where it's just kind of feeding the current siloed approach and kind of the current dysfunction. So I think that was a great point for you to bring up. I just want to mention something that was put into the chat box about the best person to fill this new position. I'm assuming meaning the empowered deputy commissioner position should be someone with food industry experience. This type of person will have experience with the challenges at the manufacturing level, as well as meeting the state and federal requirements. And that's certainly a good point. And I think it's one of the points that this coalition group has brought up, in that there needs to be somebody in charge that has some food policy experience, whether it's industry, state, local government. I think that is the kind of the issue that we're encountering now, in that typically the FDA commissioner is someone with a strong medical product background, and thus doesn't have quite the knowledge of the nuance of food policy. So kind of wanted to kind of get everyone's sense of that, of how that could help improve kind of the dynamic and the strategic planning that goes on within the foods program. Jen, do you want to start with that?
I think from what I saw in the chat, it was someone who has the food industry experience. And as an industry person, I'm biased. I would say, sure, that would be fantastic. But as I look back at who's been in either the deputy commissioner position, or before that, the assistant and associate commissioner position, when food was elevated to the commissioner level at all, people have come, excellent leaders have come from some different backgrounds, always having familiarity with food, having that connectivity with food and the openness to listen to the diversity of food system stakeholders. So I don't think that it would serve any of us well to be ultra prescriptive in defining the qualifications of the person, other than familiarity with food versus the drug side, I would say. And it is leadership, collaboration, that view toward prevention, kind of the understanding of the food system. I'm not sure that it must be someone from the food industry proper, although if there was a great person from the food industry, sure, I'd be all for that.
Yeah, and depends on the person. I think consumer groups could line up in support as well. Dr. Ostroff, did you have any comments about that?
Well, what I would say is you really need somebody who understands the food system and understands, I think, who their customers are. I like to say that the ultimate customer is the consumer, and but there are multiple customers. There's the states and locals. There's industry. There's a variety of them. I think one of the things that FDA has often been criticized for, especially on the medical product side, is being too close to industry. And so it may be a bit of a problem to have somebody who comes from within the industry, but I will say they understand, what the agency regulates. And so there is definitely a role for them. The other thing that I would say is that I do think, while we focused on this one sort of leadership position, that there needs to be a fairly high level position within the food program itself, that its main responsibility is working with state and locals. We need this to be a seamless system. And there's lots and lots of data floating around at the state and local level that the FDA is totally blind to. And I think we would all be well served if we could all look at each other's information and actually use it when indicated.
Great, thank you. Joe, did you want to add anything?
I would just add, I agree with Jen. It's hard to prescribe. I see somebody mentioned in chat, or somebody mentioned last week, it should be somebody from manufactured food. But then you have the argument, well, what about retail? There's a lot more retail that it's such a big system, the state and locals, and there's so much, a laboratory. It just needs to be somebody that has an understanding of the food system rather than somebody from medical products.
Yeah, the last thing that I'll say is that, I mean, you look at Frank Yanis's background, and there's somebody who's been in the food industry for 30 some years at both Disney and at Walmart, and understands all levels. I mean, even to the point where Walmart now actually manufactures, and so he has a great depth of understanding about the way the food system works.
That's a great point, Dr. Ostroff. Just want to answer a quick question about where the comments go. I think the link was provided. So it's the Reagan-Udall Foundation stakeholder portal. It is being run by the Reagan-Udall Foundation. I think there was a question about that as well. And again, the comments will close this Friday, October 7th. So it's really important for everyone to submit them as quickly as possible and provide that kind of big picture look for the expert panel. And let's see, what else do we have in here? I think it's important for FDA staff to also attend meetings and events where state and local staff are also attending. Meeting and get to know each other is important. That's absolutely true. And it gets to our point too that we make about there's some really great people that work in the foods program, and we encounter them all the time. And the comment that I made during the meeting last week was, the institution may bestow second-class status on the foods program, but the foods program itself is filled with first-class people. They're very passionate about preventing foodborne illness, protecting public health, and those talents need to be leveraged more. They need to be leveraged better. And I think this kind of working toward this goal, I think certainly get us to that point. And I know there was a comment about structure maybe not being the answer. And I think that certainly is a point well taken. I don't think anyone sees kind of this change in structure being the panacea, but it certainly lays the foundation toward getting us to the point where we can change the culture. And just want to talk.
What I would say, Brian, in response to that is that the structure is not necessarily the solution, but it sure can be the problem.
Absolutely. I think that's an excellent point. Why don't we just, I know we're kind of bumping up against time, but we'll just kind of take a couple more questions or just talk about kind of our impressions of the meetings last week. I know we touched upon them in our remarks, but there was also some there were some questions and comments during a lot of the sessions where it was clear that they emanated from folks who are interested in preserving the status quo. And clearly we can't afford to do that. Consumers can't, industry can't. Want to get your all impression of kind of pushback on some of those comments that were made during the sessions, some of those questions that seemed to indicate the status quo was better. And some of those questions, we obviously kind of made reference to them in our remarks, particularly the one about being able to recruit future center directors if there's this change. So I'd be curious to kind of get everyone's thoughts on that.
Well, let me start. I mean, I think they pulled together a terrific panel of folks, but it is important to note that the chair and one of the members also worked at FDA quite a while ago and are used to a certain sort of style and mode of the way that the agency operates. I do have concerns that they may not necessarily be bold enough in terms of some of the things that they may propose. But that's why I think it's so important to get this type of feedback from people who are listening to this discussion. It is not often, in my experience, that we see industry, consumer groups, and state and local governments come together and propose the same types of, recognize the same problems and propose the same solutions. I think it's telling something very important. But I do have concerns. I mean, we need bold action here. We don't need nibbling around the edges. And I do have some concerns that we may not necessarily get the outcomes that we would like to see unless we hear from everybody, unless it's a pretty loud chorus.
Jen?
I'll add that, this report has a very quick turnaround time. I think it's why the comment period closes Friday. The report is due to FDA. I believe the date is December 6th, somewhere around there. So they had 60 business days. I'm not sure that this is a problem that can be even adequately described in 60 business days. I think it's going to take longer than 60 business days to address. So we're in this for the long haul. I think that having this report is an important first step. I don't think that it is the only step. So we'll see what the expert panel comes up with, but I know that there's a lot of attention on FDA and in this area in particular, from Congress, from the diversity of stakeholders. And so although we don't know where this expert panel will land based on their experiences and then who they're talking to, what they're hearing from. I do think that there's a lot of work yet to be done by the larger group of us to keep pushing for change and to not be satisfied if we're not seeing the change that we want. And it's not change for the sake of change. It's really change so that we have an efficient, effective, collaborative and transparent FDA. And there probably are many ways that we can get there on different timeframes with different degrees of complexity, but that should be the ultimate goal, that we have an FDA that's working well to protect consumers, protect public health, and really use resources wisely.
Joe, any thoughts?
Yeah, a lot of people said a lot of the same things last week. We listened to, I think it was over 30 persons give testimony to the expert panel. And it's true, if they're going to come up with resolutions or solutions in 60 days, they're not going to do food safety culture in 60 days. And that seems to be one of the issues we need to work on. I was struck by some of the remarks I heard about FDA's relationship with some of the states. That was very bothersome to me. I'm very biased with states and locals. But one thing I will mention is somebody had said last week that if the issue is we need a deputy commissioner for foods, somebody mentioned that they could do that right now. So maybe that is something that could be done within 60 days. If everybody agrees that's what we should do, then we should do it. And that's really all I'll say. Right?
Thanks, Joe. And I think that's an excellent point. I mean, it doesn't take 60 days. Actually, it could take 60 minutes. Later today, Dr. Califf could make an announcement of this appointment for this empowered deputy commissioner. And I know there's one last question that we'll get to in the Q&A about the structure, and hopefully I'm understanding it right, kind of food oversight and how it relates to the federal government structure. And I think everyone agrees that if you were to develop a food safety system, started from scratch, it certainly would not resemble anything like what exists right now. I think ultimately, if you were to get to this point of a single agency, it would take a lot of time and a lot of steps along the process. The first being, let's get the FDA house in order. Let's get the foods program in order by appointing this empowered deputy commissioner position. and see how that, what kind of effect that has in terms of culture change. Perhaps after that, there's this separating the food part out and creating that separate agency under HHS with a separate commissioner, and then ultimately long-term have a single agency. So, that's, I think that's kind of where we're at right now, and maybe we should wrap up. I know we're way over time, so I appreciate everyone's patience and indulgence. I think it just speaks to the importance of this issue, and it's important that we all comment, because I think FDA is counting on all of us to, sweep this under the rug or forget about it, and wait for all of us to kind of move on to the next shiny object. And when you have an unprecedented coalition that's come together like this, it's really important, and it speaks to just how critical these programs are and how important it is to everyone. So why don't we wrap up there? I don't know if there's any kind of last comments that you all want to make before we sign off. Dr. Ostroff?
The only thing that I'll say is that, it's like the old Chinese proverb that every journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And this is hopefully the first step.
Jen?
Get your comment in.
Joe?
How can I beat that? Get your comments in. They're really that important.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. A recording of this will be available if you want to access it later or send it to folks. Again, the comment deadline is this Friday, October 7th. Certainly ask any of us for guidance on kind of talking points. Certainly there's nothing wrong with repeating the same message. Certainly I think it would resonate with this expert panel. Look out for the report due December 6th for its recommendations, and submit comments. Those should be everyone's top 3 priorities in the next week. So thanks again for joining, and we will see you all soon.